Well, good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are in the United States or the world. We absolutely appreciate everyone attending today's webinar on building websites people can actually use. My name is Tom Robbins, and joining me today is Joel Baglian, who is with HighMonkey Consulting. Everyone hopefully on the line today is very interested in building websites that people can really use. It's been a really hot topic that I know I get asked about constantly, and when I started talking with Joel, it became apparent that they have some fantastic experience around this and that they have agreed to come and share it with us, which is always nice to get some great feedback from our partner community around what they're seeing in the industry and also how they approach things. Because as you think about it, building websites that have great usability is a great and fantastic way to get people to be able to leverage the work you do to do some great things on the internet. So I'm sure everyone didn't come to hear me, Joel. So with further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you so that we can get into the details. Joel?
Sounds good. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the intro. First off, welcome everybody. I wanted to just say I appreciate your time here this morning and want to introduce what we'll be talking about today. Please ask any questions you have during the webinar. I will say and just kind of remind everyone that as you ask questions, some of them may be things that I'll be covering coming up, so I may say, there's holes on that, we'll get to it. So a little bit of background on HighMonkey. This is not a shameless commercial, but just so you know, we are a certified Kentico partner working on getting our gold certification. We've been doing websites since '98. Actually, I'll give you a clue. I've actually been building websites since '94, late '93. So I've been back in the days of stone knives and bear skins of when you built websites with really blunt objects and code, and oh man, it was horrible. But anyway, so we've been there, we've done that, we've seen just about everything. Everything that we do is based on user experience as a focus. If you don't build a website people can use, you've wasted your time, you've wasted your money. I mean, it's as simple as that. I can't even state it more clearly than that. We've worked with a number of different content management systems. I'll be honest with you, Kentico is our favorite. We love it. We actually use it for our own HighMonkey site. Obviously, that's why we're here today. We feel that strongly about it and love what we're doing. We have clients all over the place, and I just will say with a name like HighMonkey Consulting, we obviously have a sense of humor. Hopefully, you'll see a little bit of that as we go through the slides here today. I've tried to make them at least hopefully visual and engaging and entertaining, and we'll go from there. So I just want to ground everyone on what we're going to be covering. And this was what we stated up front. We're going to talk about usability studies. When you conduct them, what's the value? What goes into creating a user-centric information architecture? Big 50-cent words, but you'll see why it matters. I want to give you some new ways to think about and how to rewrite your content. Why design makes a difference. And often what we see is less is more. And, you know, it's difficult sometimes to design simply, and we'll get into some of the reasons behind that. Also, looking at content management systems, why it doesn't have to be a painful process. Talk about mobility, mobile websites, when's the right time, how do you do that, what's your approach, and also how to gain buy-in for your information architecture. We often have been confronted with C-level executives or, you know, people in highly placed political positions within, say, government agencies when we've done websites. And, you know, their comment may come back, well, I don't like it. And our comment back to them is, yeah, but let us show you the science behind what we've done. And what's more important, your opinion or the end users you are serving. So we are not afraid to be blunt. We're not afraid to be diplomatically confrontational when it's appropriate, and that's our approach. So here's the tasks that go into building a website. Now, this is everything. So I'm just going to say, you know, don't get overwhelmed, but there's a lot of steps to it. Those of you that have done this in the past, you've done a, you know, from scratch, or you've done a redesign, or you've managed the process, you know the things that go into it. It's not just simply select a content management system and build a website. Yes, you can do that, but whether or not you reach the targeted audiences you have, or whether or not you're able to actually make that investment worthwhile is a whole nother story. So obviously project planning is important. Defining the information architecture, we're going to spend a chunk of time on that, and we'll look at those 4 little sub-bullet points there about requirements, strategies, doing card sorts, wireframe and concepts, and doing screen mockups. Then we're going to talk about usability and when it matters and why it matters. We'll look at design and branding. Not huge detail, but you kind of see that interspersed throughout. We'll talk about what goes into looking at a CMS and selecting one. And then we'll talk about the actual build of a website, just some high points on that. We're not going to get into the real technical nuts and bolts of how you put it together. That's another webinar for another time. But we're going to talk about content migration. How does that work? And the testing you need to do. You'll notice documentation training is grayed out. We're not going to really talk about that. That's something that is part of every project we do, but that's not really part of today's focus. So here's our methodology. Now, this is kind of, we're a design company, so we like visual stuff. But if you start top left, you can see we talk about requirements, identifying audiences and content strategy, card sorts, work our way around to wireframe design. We get into design and branding in the middle there. We talk about alpha, beta, and release stages. We'll get into that. Usability testing, and you got over on the left in the middle, Kentico, good CMS system, one of the best out there in the world that could be selected. This isn't necessarily perfectly linear. You could actually select your content management system right at the very beginning. And there's different points in time here where you can actually start implementing it. We'll get into when and when's the right time, that sort of thing. Then you've got down on the bottom left, design and build, migrate your content, testing, and then launching and deploying your site. Straightforward methodology. We just wanted to give you a visual rather than trying to say, here's your 250-item Microsoft project plan. This just kind of encapsulates it a little bit better. So, information architecture can be kind of a dry topic if we want it to be. I'm going to say right up front, it's a practice, it's not a strategy, and what that means is it takes some work. It doesn't just happen magically, and it takes refinement. It takes effort to make it really work correctly. And real quick, I see that Mike asked a question about slides being available, and yes, they will be. So if you're wondering about that, we'll make these available to you. The second bullet there, in information architecture, there is no single right answer, so you need to be comfortable with a little bit of ambiguity. And that doesn't mean that you have an information architecture that can't be defended. You just have to recognize up front there's a lot of statistics and science and analysis that goes into it, but there is some interpretation. There is some art that goes into it. So be comfortable with that, and we'll get you through the thinking on it. Number 3 is kind of like a quote from the mind of the client. We thought an org chart, our organization chart, was the same as the sitemap. Well, no, it's not, because the way that you think about your business, your products, your services is not the way that your public consumers of your website information think about it. Same thing with number 4. It's just not the case. People don't think about information the same way. Your end users on your website do not think about information the same way that you do inside your company. Number 5, we like that term putability. In other words, if I put the content out there on the site, people can get to it. Well, no, that's not true. And most of you that have been in this business for a while know that. It's about findability. And then the last one, isn't search the answer? Well, sometimes it is. Not everyone searches. And we'll talk about why that's different depending on, sometimes it's generational, it's demographic, all those types of things. So let me show you an example. This is a client that we worked with a number of years ago. It's a smaller community college here in Minnesota, which is where iMonkey is based. On the left side is what they used to have. Basically, it kind of grew organically. They had 101 links on their home page. Actually, I think they had 156 links on their home page. No one could find anything. It's not surprising. It's It's what happens when you don't have an information architecture or any rules or governance or planning around how you grow your site. On the right side, that's what it looks like. This is a direct result of the information architecture process I'm going to describe. You'll see groupings of information down at the bottom. One of them I'm going to point out to you. If you look in that kind of the bottom third of the page where it says about us, all about money, become a student, and so on, the second one in there, it says all about money. Look at what's listed there. It says cost to attend, how to pay, financial aid basics, types of financial aid, and apply for financial aid. That is one of our best examples of what comes out of what we call a card sort, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. That title, all about money, was suggested to us by actual end users of this website. We didn't come up with it. This is the voice of the customer, the voice of the students, the voice of the alumni, the parents that wanted to have a better website for this college. So that's the difference that it can make in what you start with and what you end up with. So real quick, a few slides here on how information architecture is broken down. There's three components to it. There's context, content, and users. Context, let me get to that specifically and show you what that means. So we know that all websites exist in an organization. They have a context around your business, whether you're a government agency, whether you're a for-profit company, a nonprofit, whatever it may be. You've got goals, strategy, mission, all that good stuff. Well, those have to be aligned with what your public website or your intranet is going to accomplish. You have to think about what the organization needs to get from the website. So I'm not just focused on a public-facing site. It could also be your intranet. So you have to look at the internal side of the business. So that's one element of it. Content. A lot of information out there. Documents, services, all that stuff. What do you have? What format is it in? Who owns it? A lot of those questions. That goes into part of the analysis that has to happen as part of the information architecture. Users. Every user has a different experience that they draw from. Every user has different needs and wants. And then the last question I cannot emphasize enough, do you know how your users actually use your site right now? And if you don't know that, you have no business redesigning your website. You need to ask them. And there's a process, a methodology for asking users what they need from your website. Let me give you a quick side example here. I had a conversation actually a couple of weeks ago with one of the counties here in Minnesota, one of the county governments, and they wanted to understand our methodology. 20 people in the room, all these different, government employees, some high-level, executives, and I said to them, I said, I know all of you have an opinion in this room of what you want your county website to be displaying out to the public. And I said, but all of your opinions are trumped by mine because I reside in your county. And what I need from your website matters most, not what you think I need. And there were a few people that had a hard time getting that. Most people really got it. But that's the kind of thing you have to know. What do your users need from your site? So I'm going to keep us moving here. So what feeds an information architecture? There's a lot of different things, and I don't want anyone to get scared off by this, because one thing I can tell you is that there's ways that you can choose pieces of this to build an information architecture. We've worked with clients where they said, look, all our budget allows us to do is maybe do user requirements, do some card sorting, and then wireframing. You can get some pretty good results. So I'm going to show you everything that typically can go into an information architecture, why they all work together, and look at this as a way of saying, well, but you can choose pieces of this that maybe add the most value or are specific to what your organization needs. And that's what I want to just give you a sense of. So usability tests. If you do a usability test on your current site, as it is now, today, you're going to learn a lot. I'll explain that in a moment. That feeds the information architecture. So do user requirements. Again, what do your end users need from you? The business requirements. How do your employees, how do your, the people you work with, how do they use that website, whether it's an intranet, whether it's a public-facing site, do they refer client calls that come in out to that public site because they use it as their one source, their definitive source of knowledge, or what do? So internally, business requirements, how is that site used? Your strategy for the web, what are you doing with it? Is it just a public-facing website? Do you have a mobile website? Where are you going with it? There's a lot of things that go into that conversation. Content strategy. If you think that a content page with 5,000 words on it is going to really connect with your audience, I hope you know your audience. If you think that 50 words and half a dozen images would connect with them better, that's good too. But what is your strategy? We'll talk about that. What's the level your content is written at? Things like that. Open and close card sorts, I'll talk about those in detail, but those are also feeders into the information architecture. Wireframe designs, I'll explain those in more detail, give you some examples. And then the usability testing around wireframes and what that matters, why that matters. So that's what feeds an IA. We're going to look at each one of these individually. So first off, what goes into a usability test? Here's the types of things that we look at when we conduct usability tests. Can people accomplish basic tasks? How efficient is it? Can they remember? Is it something that people can learn quickly and remember how to do something over and over? Are there problems? Do people go down a path and get a 404 error, basically a problem? They get lost. Is it easy to use? Is it pleasant? And let me give you a couple of quick side comments here. I've had a number of situations where I've sat down with clients or prospective clients, and I've said, well, what do you guys do around usability? And sometimes we'll hear, especially the technical people, say, oh, well, we look at our web server logs and we look at our Google Analytics of the traffic we get to the site. And it's like, and what does that mean to you? And they say, well, that tells us, that gives us everything we need to know about usability. And it's like, well, no, it doesn't. What it tells you is a small piece of the puzzle. It doesn't tell you what information people really need. It doesn't tell you what they want, and it doesn't tell you what might be missing from your site. It also doesn't tell you why people give up in disgust or abandon trying to navigate your site. So it doesn't tell you much. It gives you some insights of pages that people land on, where they maybe go to, information that's of most interest, but that's only a little piece. So just want to make sure everyone's clear in that. Usability testing is a lot more than just looking at logs and that sort of thing. Why it matters. What it does, usability, gives you a representative mix of your audience members. So I'm going to focus right now on public-facing websites, just as an example. And I'll give you some specifics of what audiences can look like in a couple of slides, but there's a number of different types of behaviors that we look at when we do usability. So for example, we would have maybe a series of 12 to 20 questions that someone would go through, and it would be like, you are this person, where would you find information about X? Or you need to find a form that says this, where would you go? So it's all around behavior. Where would people go? How do they look for things? How do they view things? What do they interpret information to mean? We actually record the session, so you see a video recording of the screen they're on and a little PIP, picture-in-picture, of the tester down on the bottom right. And it captures what they say. We've had some situations where we've captured people that we needed to bleep out some of their comments because they were angry at the moment for some very good reasons, not at us, but with their, with the particular website, and they were frustrated. And before we showed them back to our client, we actually had to kind of clean them up a little bit. But that fourth bullet point, I want to stress this more than anything else. No matter who it is in your organization, it is almost impossible to argue against the cold hard facts of a usability test when you see a video of someone trying to navigate their way through a website, and whether it's a public site or an intranet or where it is, and they get frustrated and they get lost and they say, what the heck, why can't I get to this simple form? Or all I want to do is search for this and I get 10 pages of search results that make no difference at all to me. You get that raw intelligence, that raw information from people, and I can guarantee you there's very few, owners of a website, executives, company owners that can really argue against, if this is your end user and this is what they're telling you, you need to pay attention. It's a loud and clear voice. So one thing I want to share with you, we did a project recently for one of the states, and it was for the unemployment insurance public-facing website that they have. And what I want to say about that is that obviously in Minnesota, when someone is, unfortunately, if they lose their job or they quit or whatever, they may be able to qualify for some type of financial assistance. Unemployment insurance is how we term it. Well, what we found through the usability testing was people that went to the unemployment site, first they were frustrated and often angry because they'd been laid off from their job. It wasn't usually people who quit, but first they were angry, they were frustrated, sometimes they were just scared. So what we found from usability testing was people wanted to know three things. When they went to this website, they had three questions they needed to have answered. One is, am I going to be okay? That was their number one question. The second question is, what help can I get? And the third one is, how long does it take? So we had to help create an information architecture to answer those questions, but to also support that very emotional need to feel confident, to be able to navigate and find information quickly that would answer those questions and reassure someone that they were going to be at least as okay as they could be, well, regardless of what the circumstances were. That's a challenge. Now, not everyone's going to face that same type of situation. If you're selling a product, there's a different situation there. If you're selling services, that may be different. Unemployment insurance is a very emotional connection with people. So that's the type of thing you have to think about, and that's why usability does matter. It's that loud and clear voice of your audience. I'm going to talk about this briefly, and then I'll jump back over to audiences. Business and user requirements. Just going to state very quickly, what do internal users need from the website? External visitors need from the website. Audiences. Who are your audiences? How do you know that? I hope you know, but how do you know? And then content. How is it relevant? What about generational differences, viewer behaviors? And I'll talk about that in detail. When is text good, but when should you go visual? And making it real, telling a story that engages visitors. So we're going to get into the specifics of that, and you'll hear me kind of weave back usability in a couple of places here. So I wanted to shift gears, talk about requirements and strategy. First off, audiences. Here's some examples. For a college or university, high school seniors, parents of students, veterans, non-traditional students, which may mean us adults that are working full-time that maybe want to go back and take a class or two, online students, guidance counselors, alumni, news media, elected officials. Same thing for nonprofit companies. I won't read them all off there, but you've got a lot of potential different audiences out there. So do you create a website for each one of those audiences? Well, of course not. But how do you get people to the content that they need? And maybe you can only focus on half of those audiences on your website. Or maybe even internally, you have to look at, who within your organization do you focus on first, second, third for your audiences. When you do a usability study, you can often find ways to I guess you could say, hit more than one audience with a person. So for example, let's say you wanted 8 or 10 people to be part of a usability study on your current website. You might find, and I'll give you the example here, for a college, you might have someone who is a parent of a student, a prospective student, who also might be a veteran, who also might be an online student themselves, working on a class or two, and who may also be an alumni. So sometimes you can get a two-fer or a three-fer or whatever you want to call it, where you've got multiple of these audiences represented in one person. So there's ways to be very efficient with usability. You don't have to go out and test 25 people. What we usually see is about 8 people for a usability test. If you can represent your audiences well, you get 85% accuracy of the results, and you really have to, I mean, it takes a lot more effort, a lot more people, time and money to get much better than that. We often don't see that it's worth it. So if you're thinking about usability testing and someone says to you, yeah, we have to test 25 people, no, not so much. You should really rethink that a little bit. So that's how you want to kind of be thinking about your audiences. You have to prioritize them. You know, where are they coming from? Who for your company, are you looking just at product buyers? Are you looking at, warranty type audiences? Do you move them off to different websites? That sort of thing. I'll give you an example. The client I mentioned before is the unemployment insurance client. They had 2 primary audiences. One audience was every person in the state who was currently or potentially unemployed. The other audience was any employer or their agent, like their accountant, who has to put money into the unemployment system. Their audiences were pretty simple, really, but not everyone is so lucky. So, content strategy. Let me shift gears to you on this one. I'd like to talk about why it matters. Searching, a lot of people search. A lot of people are frustrated by search. We often will get the question of, hey, I just want our search to work like Google, and often we'll say back, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek, so how many billions are you planning to spend? Because that's why Google works so well, is they have invested heavily. You can do an amazing amount of things with search for your website without a huge investment, so I don't want to discourage you. But you have to think about it. And misspellings, alternative spellings is one of the things. I'll give you one example. We worked with another state agency, is actually the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And I'm thinking here that for most of you, if you ever did a search on the word biodiesel, there's probably, for the 20-plus people here on the call today, or on the webinar today, there's probably at least 15 different ways that people would spell that. bio-diesel, there's all these different ways. Well, what we found was there actually were about 15 different ways that people would search for biodiesel. And what we found was that only if they spelled it the one correct way would they find any information. Everything else would deliver no results. Well, that one correct way was number 12 out of 15 of the ways it was spelled. So one of the things you can do with search is set it up to look for these alternative misspellings and direct them to the right content. Same thing with terminology. It doesn't matter, and I'll give you the Department of Agriculture again as an example. I'm sure that most of you on the call have heard of mad cow disease. It exists, of course. Well, when we worked with the Department of Agriculture, we did a search on that and found nothing. And we said, well, this can't be right. I mean, it has to be something that people are interested in. We have a lot of cows in Minnesota. Well, what they told us is, oh, well, we actually, if people search on bovine spongiform encephalopathy, they'll find everything they need. And it's like, seriously? And then they said, well, but we call it by its more common name, which is BSE. So, you might be laughing at this, but that's how oftentimes people think is, oh, well, we call it this, so of course everyone else should. Well, the reality is people are looking for mad cow disease. That's just it. You got to think in terms of what your customers want, what your website users want. Search, same thing internally. If you've got a whole bunch of old stuff out there and you're not filtering old archives, someone internally on your intranet does a search for, whatever it might be, form of, something, and they get 50 results, and the last one on the list is the one they need. Yeah, I can guarantee you they're frustrated. So something else that we've found over and over and over again is, despite what you may hear about teens and 20-somethings being so technologically proficient and how early adopters they are, you know what? They really have some bad behaviors around finding information. We have seen it so many times where if they can't find it like within 10 seconds, 1-2 clicks, they abandon it. They say, I give up, doesn't exist, it's not there, not even going to bother looking. 40 to 50-year-olds actually read content. They're patient. They will dig into, they'll spend hours researching something that matters to them and find what they need. So if you have audiences anywhere between teens to, let's say 80-year-olds, you've got different behaviors. So how do you engage them? A couple of suggestions for you. Think about your content strategy. I kind of highlighted at the bottom. Tell me a story. Make me care. Show me a picture. I'm going to give you some examples. Here's one that we did recently for the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. This is a project where what we did was they wanted to engage more people in their Learn on Demand program, and we proposed writing what we called persona-based content. So we actually wrote for them Ed, Mary, Sarah, and John. They're fictitious people. The images are not of, of a real person per se with that name, but we wrote scenarios. Mary, if you see on the right screen, the right image detail, it says Mary is 34, recently laid off from her job as a bookkeeper, wants to become a nurse. And she has questions. How do you go about this? How do you do an online learning program? Ed has a different situation. He's up for promotion in management. Sarah doesn't have a car or computer but wants to become an accountant. John is an Army veteran, and now he's in the National Guard. He wants to study computers. So what we tried to do, and we're still getting feedback on how this is being received, is we're trying to create stories that are compelling, that engage people, that get them interested, that give them a reason to read information. So that's one approach. Another thing that we've done, and this is one again with the state of Kentucky, the same thing with the school system, this, take a moment, kind of take this in. This is geared toward a lot of different age groups. You could have just this flow chart that says do this, yes, no, do this, yes, no, so on and so on. We wanted to make it a little bit more visual, a little more engaging, a little more fun. And this is the kind of thing that we could have had, 2 or 3 pages of printed information that says, here's all the rules, all the requirements. Instead, we wanted to give them a snapshot so they could go through it and say, yeah, I'm interested in a degree. Oh, my ACTs aren't high enough. Okay, then here's what I got to do next. Here's what I got to do next. Then I can go ahead and register. Again, just trying to take all this stuff that we know it's a routine, it's a process. Let's get it out there and make it useful. We did another one like this. This is actually out on the state of Minnesota, the uimn.org website. If you're an employer, you want to understand the process of how an appeal works. For example, if you, as an employer, feel that this person is not entitled to receive an unemployment benefit, here's the process. It's a hearing, blah, blah, blah. There's a decision. It gives you kind of some key dates. So again, this took pages and pages of content, dull, boring, hard to read, made it into a visual one-page process diagram that you can print out. Makes it so much easier to understand. So that's some approaches that you can think about for content strategy. There's much more, but again, just wanted to give you a sense of it. So here's what we've covered so far. I'm going to roll right in here, kind of keep the momentum going. So took my deep breath here. Going to roll into open and close card sorts, wireframe design, and then wireframe usability. So next up, open and close card sorts. If you've not heard of this before, it's a very low-tech process. Basically what happens is we find about 10 audience members for an open card sort. We take index cards, again, very low-tech. We actually print out labels and slap them on cards. 75 to 100, maybe up to 110, 115 different cards of information. And it could be anything from I'll use a college example. I need to find out what loans I might qualify for. I need an escort to the parking lot at late night after class. Who do I talk to, or where do I find out information for veterans benefits? So all these different pieces of information. Now, a lot of this information, we don't just pull it out randomly. This is based on going back to the requirements, going back to an initial usability study of the existing site, what we learned from that, what content matters to people, what do people look for, why do they come there. So we don't just go in and select 100 pieces of content at random. It's done purposefully, but we also pull information that maybe from the business side you might feel is important to find out how people look at that. What do they do with it? How do they organize it? What we do is we give them these cards and we say, okay, take these 100 cards, we give them a table, literally, and we say, okay, lay them all out in front of you. Read them, lay them all out in front of you. Group them in a way that makes sense to you. We usually see 8 to 12 groupings. That seems about right. There's no perfect answer. If someone creates 3 groups, they really aren't trying very hard. So if they create 50 groups, we need to help them think a little bit more. We have to help them understand the thought process a little bit more. What happens is, let's say we've got 8 to 12 of these groups, we ask them to label those groups. Going back a few slides when I talked about all about money for the college, those group labels, that was where we got that, all about money. One of the prospective students actually came up with that name. Then we evaluate the statistical relevance of those groupings. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a moment. I'll show you an example. The closed sort, the validation, what we do is we take those group labels from the first open sort, say there's 10 of them, we put those all out in front of the person on the table and we say, okay, take these same 100 cards, they're all randomized, and group and organize them under those groups and see what they come up with. What we usually see is a very high validation level where basically people group that information typically under the same types, or they organize the information under the same types of groupings. So we look at statistical relevance, and that's where I say there's science and some art behind it. We look at, okay, 90% of the time, is this card grouped with the same cards? 80% of the time, what does that look like? 70% of the time, what does that look like? And from that, we get, well, let me talk about pros and cons, and I'll show you an example of what it looks like. It's simple, it's cheap, quick to execute, provides a good foundation. It's not perfect. There are some cons to it, but at the same time, it does give you a very good indication of what matters to people and what they look for. The results typically look something like this, and I know this is hard to read, so don't strain your eyes trying to squint at it. But this is where we look at the relevancy and we say, okay, for this card sort, we see information on these cards. Each one of the lines is a piece of information, and these are how they're grouped in these different types of categories. We have to do some interpretation behind that. It's not always going to be perfect. We might have some pieces of content that are orphaned that we can't, we just don't know where they fit. So we have to kind of interpret those. There's a question here. It says, for closed card sorting and group labels, who defines what those labels are? In the closed card sort, the one where we have the participants actually name the groups. In the closed card sort, what we do is we take what we, HighMonkey, and our client agree on as what seems to be the theme or the group labels for the closed card sort, and we provide those. So when the person shows up for the closed card sort, they'll see 10 or however many groups that we think, based on this interpretation of the screen that you're seeing right now, this card sort result, we come up with the group labels. So that's where some of that interpretation and art, if you want to call it, comes in. So that's kind of the high level of card sorts. There's a lot more we could talk about. I know we don't want to cover too much here in the time we have, but wireframes, I just want to talk briefly about that. There's not really a whole bunch of color or graphical, there's no color or graphics and things like that. Wireframes are designed to show the layout and organization of content. They're fed by all of the things we've talked about. They're a visual model of the information architecture. They also serve as a build guide for the content management system, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. We also recommend them for mobile sites. I'm going to go through some examples. I'm going to show you several wireframes and then the actual end results. So let me do that fairly quickly. I want to be thoughtful of our time here. Here's one that we did. Again, this is for the same college in Oka Ramsey. These are wireframes. It's to show Navigation, how content could be organized and displayed. Here's the end result. You've seen that before. Here's another one. This is for the Veterans Affairs website. Here's what we call our alpha design, 4 different examples. The one on the top right, more of that retro look, is what they're actually going to go with. But we did the wireframes first before we even got to the creative design. This is our own site, wireframe of what we are concepting. Here's what it looks like now, again built on the Kentico platform. Here's one for mobile. This is what we're doing for our own site right now. We're in the process of building out our mobile. We built out wireframes to show all of what we would be, how we'd be templating the site, again using the mobile development tools within Kentico to build that. So that's kind of the quick view of wireframes and how they then serve as your build guide, because you have a very clear picture of what the layout, the navigation, what content appears where, the organization and structure of the pages based on, again, what people need, how they find information. So that's what feeds an IA. Now I want to move on a little bit more here. We've gotten through this so far. We're going to talk about design and branding, CMS, the build, content migration. I'm going to remind you where we are. Maybe I'm using a little kind of a hammer here, but this is where we are. So design and branding 101, basics. Here's what you should think about. Design should support your key messages, enhance your visitor's experience, and oftentimes simplicity in design is difficult to achieve. Google has a very simple design, but they have a simple purpose behind their site. You have to go deeper to find all the other stuff, but their homepage is about as simple as it gets. Not saying everybody's site should be Google, but just saying that's one example. We like an iterative process. We use what we call alpha beta release. Won't get into the details, but it keeps, you don't have too many reviews, but you keep it focused and moving forward. You also should not involve too many people in the design process because everybody has an opinion, and I can guarantee you, it gets too big and it starts to become wrapped around the axle. One thing I will say is branding standards, if companies or organizations already have them, sometimes those branding standards may need to be looked at once a information architecture has been developed, because they may be designed more for print or more for other types of standards versus what a new website would look like. So that's the basics to design. CMS, Evaluation Criteria. I'm going to talk specifically about Kentico. Here's some things that I think you should think about, and I recommend to clients that they think about when they're looking at content management systems. How long has it been around? How many versions has it gone through? What's the longevity of the company? Kentico has a great history. It's got a huge installed base. I think, if I remember right, I read 16,000 sites around the world, and it's pretty big. So it's a very solid, stable .NET platform. Got to look at license and software maintenance costs. Kentico is a very cost-effective product to use. We recommend it frequently for that reason, as well as many others. This third bullet point I really want to make a note about. Separating the content and the presentation layers. What that means is when you have, let's say you've got 1,000 pages of content you want to migrate into your new site, and you're implementing the Kentico CMS, but you want to design it at the same time. By having the option to separate those, you can actually begin that content migration process before you even do the design, before you do the presentation layers. So it's a very key factor that we find is important in your CMS evaluation. Obviously, things like support for integration with social media, mobile design, support from Kentico itself, the partner networks. The last three should be no-brainers, but how easy is it to use? Get out there and test it. Get out there and use it. Talk to one of the partners and have them set up a demo site for you to get your feet wet. Try it out. So those are some key criteria that we look at, we think about. I'll just make a note here. One of the things that we're excited about for our own site, we're doing some of the A/B testing. That's the blue box on the right side of the 6 boxes in the middle there. It says website optimization. We're actually presenting different content on the home page of our site. One version is kind of these declarative statements. The other version is haikus, which, okay, you know, we're a fun company, we have a sense of humor, but we're curious to see which of those two gets the most traction. What do people like better? Do they like the haikus or do they like the declarative statements? So we're going to see. So we're using a lot of different features. We're going to be doing more integration with our social media, all that kind of stuff. This is just one of Kentico's kind of slides I like that explains kind of how their ecosystem works. I like the term platform because it means you can do so much with it. It's not simply a content management system. There's so much that goes into it. And again, my goal isn't to give you a big commercial. It's just to kind of give you a quick overview of what to think about and what to consider in a content management system. This, I'll let you read this real quick. I agree with everything that's on here. That's why we use it. That's why we have it for our own site. Now, the build. All the way back to the requirements that you did at the beginning, design to those requirements. Don't forget that your wireframes are your visual building guide. Seriously, they are. Use those wireframes. Be able to show, here's the path that we followed from requirements to doing the information architecture, to doing the wireframes, to then building out the site. Templates are truly a beautiful thing. It allows you to reuse pages. You can create site templates. We've worked on projects where we've had, well, one in particular, I won't name the client, but they had 16 different websites that we went in and basically helped them both with consistency in naming, consistency in templates, reusable objects, you know, web parts, all that sort of thing so that they could manage those sites so much better, and they had done them kind of chaotically. So build to your audience's technology if you can. Intranets, internal sites, often you can control or understand what's going on with browser types, versions, that sort of thing. We have seen situations where we've built sites, and I'll give you one example. I won't name the client, but it was an intranet site that we built for a client just recently that has 42,000 employees around the world. We had to design it to be as fast as possible because many of their locations were in Asia where bandwidth issues were a big concern. So we even had to think about bandwidth, which, you know, sometimes, you know, we get used to, oh, well, we live in an area that has, you know, all this high-speed internet and things like that. But you have to sometimes think about those things. Making it reusable, I talked about web part containers. That's a really nice feature of Kentico to be able to reuse elements in the design. And make sure that you structure the organization of your site in a way that makes sense. Again, a way that makes sense to you when you're managing it or building it, but don't just do it randomly. Think it through, document it, and then test the heck out of it. Test during the build. You know, you can't start testing soon enough, and I know maybe that sounds a little cliche, but that's really true. And we recommend, in fact, I'll comment on that next. Excuse me, after content migration about testing. So content migration, if you have 100 pages or 10,000 pages, seriously, starting yesterday might not be soon enough. There's a lot to it. We often see upwards of 20% of the content that's currently on an existing website that can be archived. It's out of date, hasn't been looked at forever. When we go out there and we do content migrations, we have a tool we use to inventory all the content and files on a website. We put that into actually it's a tool that we built in SharePoint that we use to manage that process. It's very, very cool. We've used it for about 6 projects, anywhere from literally a couple hundred pages to one project that I think had over, geez, I'm trying to remember here, I think they had upwards of about 5,000 pages. But what that allows you to do is it allows you to track each page, each file, make sure that it's reviewed. Yes, no, does it move forward? You know, does it get archived? It allows you to go in and make sure you've got any rewrite completed. You know, is it rewritten in a way that makes sense? You know, are there standards around the process? Is it written to the 8th grade level that you're shooting for? Does it have, you know, is it written with creativity? Is it written with visual examples? Is it short amount of content? All those sorts of things. Do you have headers? Do you have alt tags? All the things you want to think about for accessibility. And then the right amount of metadata. Now what that means, again, it depends, but if you, for example, have this goal of every piece of content, every page, every file that goes into your website has 15 required fields of metadata, I can guarantee you that you're not going to ever have anyone wanting to put content in your website. If you have 3 or 5 fields of metadata that need to be added for a document, it's going to make your search results much more relevant. You can't go overboard, but you got to get the right information and prioritize in there so you've got search that matters, because search is important. So content migration can be overwhelming if you let it be overwhelming. Like anything else, if you plan it, if you think it through, put some rules around it, start early enough, it's not gonna overwhelm you. It's still going to be difficult. It's a lot of heavy lifting, so I won't ever kid you on that. But it's something that can be managed. We've done it successfully. Like I said, we love the SharePoint tool we built to do that. It's just something that has to be done. Testing, real quick, and we're almost done here, so I want to leave a little more time in case there's questions. Well, you got to have a testing plan. You got to go back to those original business and user requirements. Make sure that what you deliver on your website actually can be tested, actually shows, yes, here's what we were told that matters to our users. Here's how it's organized. Here's how it ties back to the wireframes, back to the card sorts, so that people actually can test it and say, yeah, it does deliver this content in a way that makes sense to people and they can find it. When you're testing, obviously, create a tracking list, prioritize those things. People that aren't familiar with your project, your website, they should do the testing. Bring in your end users, whatever. Sometimes it's worth giving them $40 or $50 to have them spend an hour testing. You know, get people to volunteer. In the United States, I know we have an international audience. You know, we talk about the WCAG and 508 compliance. That's accessibility. You know, people who maybe have hearing difficulties with hearing or visual impairments and things like that. And yeah, I mean, we joke, but click like a maniac. I mean, test everything, everywhere. We often will suggest, again, not trying to overdo the testing. There are times when a post-launch usability testing does make sense. Oftentimes what that will do, we've done that with some clients where we'll test their current site before we do any changes to it, and then we'll wait for, say, a month or 2 months after the site is launched and it's gone through all the, you know, kind of minor tweaks. We'll do a usability test afterwards, same questions, to show usually, and often actually with our projects it's always been the case, that people can find what they're looking for, they can find it efficiently, they don't get frustrated. It really shows that the money you spent, the time you spent was worth it. You have a site that people can actually use. So you finally at that point, you launch your site. Yeehaw. Maybe I should say that louder, but it's still not done. I mean, yes, it's awesome. You should celebrate, but you've got mobile development to finish up. Not every site has to be mobile enabled, but most of them do. So think about that. You always have room to do more marketing, more social media, all that stuff. It really never ends. So what we covered, we looked at usability studies, their value, when they can happen, what goes into that user-centric information architecture, talked about scenario-based content, or excuse me, you know, kind of user-based content, scenario-based content, persona-based content, images versus words, the process of design, what to think about for a content management system, mobile, what to think about there. We talked about the wireframes, what to look at, how that works, and then how to gain that buy-in. And what I've described, the whole process, the methodology, whether you choose a couple of pieces of it or you want to go the whole way with all those different types of steps, that's what gains you buy-in for the end result of your website. And I'll say this very quickly. We've worked with a number of clients where we've had, one in particular, we had I guess you could say like a stakeholder meeting. We had 75 people attend this meeting, and we presented, it was about, I think we're at the point where we were just about to start wireframe. Actually, yeah, we'd done some initial wireframing, so we'd gone through all the information architecture. We showed everyone where, what had happened, the usability tests. We actually showed them video clips of those tests. We showed them the requirements. We showed them the card sort results, and we explained the process. Then the next time, about 2 months later, we went through the information. We went through the wireframes, the testing on that. We went through the initial alpha and beta designs, and then the layout and how the content management system and the migration of content was going to work. By the time that site launched, and this is a big project, those key stakeholders were our biggest champions internally for that organization. There wasn't really a single person, because they understood the process. They had buy-in. They were committed, and they still are. They're very committed to how the website is serving them internally by letting them serve their external audiences better. So this is the type of information that will give you that type of credibility. It gives you the reasons, it gives you the logic, it gives you the thought process to be able to say, this is why it matters, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And we're not going to just throw things randomly up on the home page. We can't do that. It violates our information architecture. So it also gives you, if you're the webmaster, if you're the owner of the site, it gives you a way to really direct and be the wisdom keeper behind why your site, your website is what it is, why it's organized the way it is, and why it presents information the way it does. So that's a lot. I know we covered a lot of information. I will stick around as long as anyone would like. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. I see we have a couple of them here that just got asked. If anyone needs to leave, that's fine. I appreciate your time and attention, and thank you for being part of the webinar today. But let me switch gears here and answer a couple of questions. One was, can I speak to issues around best practices when end users or subject matter experts are responsible for a specific area of content, like techniques for deploying current content? Yeah, and I'm not sure, Mike, if your question is around like how to disperse content. If that's the case, one of the things we've seen as a best practice is, depending on the size of the organization, we usually see that if it's a kind of an older site, there's maybe 1 or 2 people that are kind of the webmasters, the content masters. They sometimes end up being bottlenecks just because of the nature of the job. Some companies will have content dispersed. They may have 100 people that are content contributors, but maybe they're not that editor or webmaster. So what we typically see is with the proper build of a website and with setting permissions correctly, you can have access to certain areas. So for example, a subject matter expert that is doing content around a product line versus all product lines, they can have access. You can limit their access to what they can update, or whether they can add content but not approve it, whether they can do editing. So you can also put in place workflows to have an approval process. So if a SME contributes a specific topic or specific content, it could launch a workflow then to be reviewed by maybe the editor for the content in that area, and maybe there's 10 SMEs that are contributing, but they still go through an editor. So there are a lot of best practices that we've worked on. Again, depends on the situation. But I hope, Mike, that answers your question. And again, any other questions, very happy to take them. I'll stick around as long as people would like.